nice to have the inaugural this academic year because this marks my first 10 years in Birmingham, hopefully not the last. And I'm really happy to be here. What I'm going to do now is just tell you a little bit about how my research has progressed from the time I was interested in rationality as a PhD student to the projects that I'm running now in Birmingham, saying maybe not very much about the past and more about the present, what my current interests are, and how I think they may be relevant to other things that we're doing in Birmingham and elsewhere. So the plan is really to look at the relationship between human agency and rationality. And one question that philosophers, not just philosophers, social scientists, psychologists, but philosophers in particular, have asked about the mind is really whether, and to what extent, irrational behavior undermines agency. So that's the first question. When we behave in irrational ways, when we have irrational beliefs, are we still agents? Are we still successful agents? And my answer will be yes, we are still agents. Sometimes we're even successful agents. And the next step would be to ask whether there are circumstances, and this is much more counterintuitive, where actually behaving irrationally is good for us as agents, whether it supports our agents in some way. And although I'm at the very beginning of asking this huge question, I'm just going to tell you about two cases where I think an argument can be made for irrationality to be at least partially, at least in some context, good for us. And the first case is the case of confabulation, and in particular a case when we are asked to explain our own choices and we don't really know much about how those choices came about, how they were produced, but we tell more than we can know. We give an explanation anyway, even if we ignore some important causal features of the process that led us to make those choices. The other case I want to look at is optimism, especially unrealistic optimism. That is when we have certain beliefs about ourselves and certain predictions about our own future, which are too positive given the evidence that is available to us. And my conclusion will be that at least in some cases of confabulation and optimism, our being irrational in this way, not following the evidence, not being constrained by the evidence, is actually a good thing for us as agents because it helps support our motivation to act. So, agency and rationality. What is the relationship between them? When philosophers talk about agency, and I think this is probably common in other disciplines as well, they usually talk about a special type of agency, intentional agency, which is doing things for reasons, in contrast with not doing anything at all, or doing things randomly, or doing things because we have no choice. So typical humans are agents in this sense. They are intentional agents. They do things for reasons. And the things that they do are constantly being evaluated according to different standards. So we may have standards of rationality. Is what you're doing the best thing for you right now? We can have also standards that are a bit more pragmatic. Can you be successful as an agent? And when I talk about success here, I mean the simplest possible sense of success. So if you as an agent set certain goals for yourself, you are going to be successful when you fulfill your goals. So you take means that you need to in order to achieve what you set yourself to do. Irrationality is more complicated. It's a huge value concept. It's clearly a negative connotation, but the way in which we apply it to different things, for instance, we apply it to agents themselves, we apply it to what they think, we apply it to what they do, means that very often we are confused about what irrationality means unless we specify what it is. And here is just a list of some of the situations in which an agent can be deemed as irrational or what the agent does. So sometimes an agent is irrational when the behavior defies the expectations, and other people other agents find it difficult to explain or predict the behavior of that agent. Sometimes we talk about irrationality in a strange contrast between reason and emotion. So when our decisions are driven by emotional factors or intuition or instinct, rather than by something like reflective deliberation, rather than sitting down and thinking about advantages and disadvantages. I think one of the most common sense of irrationality is really about the fact that we sometimes do not conform to principles or norms of good reasoning or of logic when we're thinking. And also when our beliefs are not consistent with one another. And so we tend to believe things that clash with one another and lead to confusion or paralysis of action sometimes. Or when we have beliefs that are consistent with one another, but they do not really fit the evidence very well. So that we find that we tend to maintain beliefs that seems to be contradicted by the evidence all the time, maybe because they have a special role for us. And we will see examples of that too. And sometimes we are irrational in a more practical sense. So our actions or our thoughts are self-defeating and undermine what we want to achieve, undermine our well-being. And that's usually a judgment that comes from what other people see we're doing and where they think the consequences of what we are doing are. So each form of rationality, clearly there are lots of different standards there in the list, and the list was not exhaustive, could go for much, much longer. So each form of rationality is characterized by a set of norms, a set of standards. And some of these standards are really core, so they're basic standards, and some standards maybe are something that are more like something we aspire to rather than something we feel we need to be governed by. And basic standards of rationality in the traditional philosophy of mind literature are considered to be conditions for agency. So you can be an agent, or in a weaker thesis, you can be a successful agent, only if you are rational in the sense that you conform to some of the very basic standards of rationality. Everyday experience in dealing with ourselves and with other agents, and also the mounting psychological evidence of reasoning and behavior that we have followed for the last 50 years, have actually shown that basic standards of rationality are violated when we act, when we think, and that irrationality doesn't compromise successful agency either. So not only you can be an agent and have irrational thoughts, behave irrationally, but you can be a successful agent in the sense I've specified before, so you can achieve what you set yourself to do, even when your thoughts and your actions do not seem to conform to these basic standards. And it's not my place here to give you a full argument for that view, but I just want to give you an example of how something that we care a lot as scientists, academics, and philosophers in particular, that seems to be violated all the time, not just occasionally but systematically, which is one of the fundamental norms of epistemic rationality. And epistemic rationality has to do with the relationship between what we believe and the evidence that is available to us. So one of these basic norms is that our beliefs need to be responsive to evidence. That means that if we have a certain belief and we get evidence that that belief might not be true, we need to ask ourselves whether the evidence is robust evidence, whether we should hold on to the belief, maybe suspend judgment until we get more evidence to settle the case. So responsiveness to evidence is often conducive to the truth of our beliefs, but of course it does not imply truth. It is very appealing to believe that something like intentional agency requires rationality in this sense. So if our beliefs are not responsive to evidence, can we still coordinate our actions with other agents? Can we still explain and predict what goes on around us, understand what goes on around us? Can we plan for our own future? It seems as if it would be a challenge to do so if we had beliefs that do not respond to evidence in the right way. So rational agents adopt beliefs on the basis of evidence in their favor and are prepared to revise them or reject them when evidence against them becomes available. the study of human reasoning and decision-making suggests that standards of rationality, such as responsiveness to evidence, are systematically violated by agents. And I'm just going to give you 3 brief examples of how that can happen in everyday life. So these are, of course, psychological studies done in the lab, but they reflect tasks that we all engage in on an everyday basis. So we've heard, when we have studied the history of science, that sometimes scientists get really committed to a theory that they have out-developed, for instance, and they become quite blind to counter-evidence. It's quite difficult to persuade them that really the theory doesn't work. They can become quite resistant to amendments to their theory. But actually it's interesting to think that we become very conservative about the things we believe, even when our commitment is not as strong as that. So in this particular case, young people were asked to choose between one theory that could explain the disappearance of dinosaurs, the extinction of dinosaurs. Something had to do with volcanic eruptions, something had to do with something else. They just hear about these theories, they hear about possible evidence for and against, and they make a choice on that day, something they had not probably thought about very much before then. Then they're presented with evidence for and against the theory they have just chosen. And it's very interesting that they assess the evidence that comes in completely different ways. If the evidence is consistent, is compatible with the theory they've just chosen, they tend to think that the evidence is very good, very robust, and strongly supports the theory. But if the evidence goes against the theory they've just chosen, then they tend to think that the evidence is not robust, is not very good evidence, and actually there are alternative explanations. And here the commitment has just been made 10 minutes ago, so it's not a deep commitment to the theory, but still it shows how conservative we can become pretty quickly with the beliefs that we choose to adopt, and how we protect them from counter-evidence as much as we can. Probably a much more familiar example is the example of prejudice beliefs. Now, prejudice beliefs are notorious for being very insulated from counter-evidence. We can get lots of evidence against our prejudice beliefs and still hang on to the prejudice. And in this study, which was done in the US on restaurants, it has been shown that there is something called tableside racism, which is the fact that white waiting staff tends to have a number of negative beliefs towards customers that are either black or other ethnic minorities. And for instance, one of the common beliefs is, oh, no matter how good I will be serving these customers, they will not tip me well. Now, such beliefs very often are disconfirmed. So, of course, there are black customers that tip very generously. And what is really interesting is the kind of reasoning that the waiting staff goes through when these things happen. The surprising event is always taken to be something that signals how excellent their service was on that particular day, not how generous the customers were. And in this way, the prejudice remains and an alternative explanation is found. Another case is the case of superstitious beliefs. And this is interesting because it merges two common problems with human rationality. The fact that we sometimes are not responsive to evidence, and the fact that our beliefs very often do not form a coherent set. They clash with one another. And that's the lunar effect, right? So police officers, medics who work in emergency rooms, and mental health workers all tend to believe that more crimes, accidents, and psychological crises occur during nights of full moon, although there is no evidence suggesting that there is any causal link between the phases of the moon and these kind of episodes. Not only, but the people who have been interviewed about these issues, of course, have quite in-depth theoretical and practical knowledge of the causes of psychological crises and accidents, but that doesn't seem to make them less convinced in the truth of the prejudice belief. And on a side, there is also a is saying that actually maternity wards are very busy on nights of full moon, but you're safe. It's May 21st this moment. And we can finish the lecture, I think. So these are just some examples where people who are very well educated, very well informed about a particular domain, tend nonetheless to exhibit those forms of irrationality that we would think, maybe just theorizing from the armchair, would be quite key, quite essential to intentional agency. When we uphold a theory that has been disconfirmed by new data, or refuse to change our prejudiced beliefs in the face of counter-evidence, and maintain beliefs that conflict with other things we know, we do not stop acting for reasons. We still are intentional agents. We still do things because we intend to do them. And we behave in ways that can be made sense of. So people may think that we are unreasonable in not dropping our prejudice or racist beliefs, but they still understand why we're acting in the way we are. So we can be agents and successful agents even if we are not responsive to evidence. And standards of rationality, such as responsiveness to evidence, seem to be too demanding to count as preconditions for agency. Clearly they are an aspiration. Clearly sometimes they are things we do apply and we do conform to, but they are not a necessary constraint. After suggesting that not even systematic violations of basic standards of rationality undermine agency, I want to ask something that is much more provocative. Do some forms of irrationality support agency? So is it the case that human agency, maybe because some of its intrinsic limitations, works better when we adopt certain kinds of beliefs? And if this is the case, how does it work, right? Because, that would be interesting in itself, but what we want to know is exactly what the mechanism is. Why is it that sometimes irrationality seems to work in our favor? And I will look at two particular cases that I've chosen because they are not pathological, so they concern us all. They concern the non-clinical population in the most widespread way, which is confabulating reasons for choices and having unrealistically optimistic beliefs and predictions. So not only these are not pathological cases of irrationality, but actually it has been argued that they contribute to mental health. So they may be things that we do just because we do not have any mental pathology. So, confabulation first. Confabulation comes from fabula, which is in Latin a very interesting word because it could mean a historical account, so a very veridical story, or a fictional story, such as a fairy tale or a legend. And when we confabulate, we kind of combine the two meanings because we tell a story that we believe to be true, we have no intention to deceive, but the story itself is fictional in the sense that it's not based on evidence. So we don't know that we are telling a fictional story. We think we are telling the true story of what we are recounting, but actually confabulation is such that is ill-grounded, not based on evidence. One very common situation in which we confabulate is when we explain choices on the basis of reasons that are perfectly plausible given the choices we've made, but actually did not play a causal role in bringing about the choices that we made. And this has been observed in a variety of contexts. All of them are actually more interesting than the one I'm going to talk about today, but because consumer choice, which is what I'm going to discuss today, has been studied much more than the other domains and is less controversial, I will start from there. But we can find the same kind of mechanisms in moral preferences, political preferences, attitudes concerning romantic relationships. So even things that are quite key to our understanding of who we are as people. They are not kind of marginal issues. They are choices and attitudes that define ourselves. So the classic study here, which I'm sure most of you know, is the 1977 study by Nisbet and Wilson. And they were interested in the fact that sometimes we make choices, but we are not aware of the mechanisms responsible for those choices. And when we are asked to give reasons for those choices, we come up with an explanation, which is perfectly plausible given the type of choice that we made, but does not seem to fit with the results of the study. So in a mall, participants are asked to choose some items as part of the consumer survey. Some participants are asked to choose between 4 different nightgowns, and other participants are asked to choose between 4 identical pairs of nylon stockings. Then both groups are asked why they made those choices. Now, what Nisbet and Wilson found is that participants' choices were very heavily influenced by the position of the items. So if you had kind of 4 different nightgowns just in front of you, most participants would choose the one which is most on the right. And that was a systematic preference. It was a very robust result. But when people then are asked, okay, you made your choice, why did you make this choice? Why did you prefer this nightgown? They mentioned, of course, not the position of the items, but features of the items, such as their softness, of their color, the quality of the texture, and so on. Even when the items, like in the case of the stockings, differed only in their position. So there were 4 identical pairs of stockings, and the only difference was how they were positioned on the table. So according to Nisbet and Wilson, this means that there are some mental processes responsible for our choices that we are not aware of. So for instance, we are not aware of certain priming effects, such as position effects. We are not aware that if we are right-handed, we have a tendency to prefer items on the right. We might become aware of that if we read about the study, but otherwise it's not the kind of thing that springs to mind when you're thinking why you chose a particular pair of socks. So what do we do when the experimenter or when our friends ask us, why did you choose this pair of socks? We come up with an explanation, which is perfectly plausible, softness, color, and so on, given our background beliefs, but does not match with how actually the choice came about. So what is interesting about confabulation is that it has some common feature that suggests that we are being epistemically irrational. So we are not really getting clues from the environment, we are not really responding to evidence. The first point is that clearly we are ignorant of some of the key causal factors that lead to the making of our choices, and forming our attitudes is just the same. So we do not realize that we are affected by certain priming effects unless we get specific information about it. The second point is that we come up with a causal claim, with an explanation, which is not based on the evidence, even if it's a plausible claim. And that is kind of interesting because nobody forces us to give an explanation of that type, we would think. We would think that we could just say, why did you choose those socks? I don't know, right? We could acknowledge ignorance, but we don't do that. We have a very strong tendency, and this is both in the clinical and non-clinical population when we're thinking about pathological and non-pathological responses. We have a strong tendency to fill the gap with something, even if that something doesn't respond to evidence. And further, and I think this is also very interesting, we commit to a further belief about the world that does not fit the evidence. When I've got the 4 identical pair of stockings in front of me, and I say, I chose this one because it's softer, I'm actually committed to say that that pair of socks is softer than the other ones, than the alternatives. And that is something false, but my ignorance is not somehow excusable in the same sense as the ignorance that concerns the mental processes that are responsible for my choices, which I may not be aware of. It's something that I should just be able to see. Those socks are just the same. But that doesn't happen, which I think is extremely interesting. So does confabulation imply a failure of rationality? Yes, some aspects of it may be more excusable than others, but certainly when we confabulate, we tell more than we can know, and we offer grounded causal claims as explanations. We also end up committing, in some cases of confabulation, not in all of them of course, to beliefs that are false when they apply to the situation in which we find us, and that are disconfirmed by evidence that is available to us, that we should be able to read off the environment. But critically, we do not realize that we do not know the mental processes responsible for our choices. So when we provide the explanation, what we would be tempted to call the made-up explanation is not actually made up, because we genuinely believe that is the true explanation. And that is what makes confabulation different from lying or different from bluffing, right? We truly believe that that's the explanation for our choice. If that's the case, then some researchers, for instance William Erskine and Martha Turner, have argued that in confabulation we are not in a position to acknowledge our ignorance, because we do not realize that we are ignorant. We think we know. We think the explanation we give is the right one. And then I'm kind of interested in a further question. If we could acknowledge our ignorance, if we could just say, I don't know why I chose this pair of stockings, would that be better for us or not? Would there be advantages in saying I don't know rather than confabulating? Clearly, from the point of view of going for the truth, confabulating is bad, because I'm providing a causal claim that is not supported by evidence. But are there other considerations? And I think there are three. Confabulation can be self-financing. By that I mean that compared to replying I don't know when I'm asked about my own choices, which may undermine my confidence and incur social sanctioning, because how can you not know why you made a choice or why you have a certain moral or political belief? Confabulating an explanation can support our sense of ourselves as competent decision makers. So believing that we have done it for a reason make us think that we are the sort of person who makes choices for a reason, even when the choice is between socks. Of course, I can tell why I chose this pair of stockings. The second point is that confabulation can help impose coherence on preferences that are often incoherent and fluctuating all the time. So by confabulating, we can make sense of behavior that would otherwise lack an explanation, because we may not be aware of the mental processes responsible for our choices, and identify threads in our choices that make our commitments more meaningful to us. I always like bright colors in stockings. Now, in the consumer choice case, it's a bit ridiculous, but again, think about the moral and political case. I'm a person who supports conservative ideas, or I'm a person who supports pro-choice. And that makes sense of a set of preferences that sometimes may not be fully coherent to start with. So the single choice becomes part of a largely coherent pattern of preferences that contributes to our image of ourselves and can also be used to guide future behavior. I'm the sort of person who loves bright colors. I'm the sort of person who next time will make another choice like this one. And third, but I think not less important than the previous 2 points, confabulation helps us to say something rather than nothing, to share the reasons for our choice, even when those reasons are misleading. Enables communication and exchange of information with the people around us in a social context. So by allowing us to share information about our choice, it allows us to get feedback from other people. Again, in the case of socks, not so interesting. In the case of moral and political views, quite a bit more interesting, because it may help us build distance between ourselves and our opinions when we get critical feedback from others. And that's interesting because Whitley says, for instance, that the healthy human brain is not a veridical recorder of events. That's not what it is supposed to do. When we are giving the explanation, we're not supposed to tell other people exactly how we got to that preference, how we got to that choice. But rather, it's a meaning machine that fills in gaps and generates false explanations via available cultural theories. And again, there is a bad side to it. The story we tell is false. But there is a good side to it, which is the story we tell is understandable by people around us, because it comprises a theory that is shared. It is understandable and plausible that people choose socks because of their softness and their color. It's not so understandable, unless you've done quite a bit of psychology, to think that you have chosen that pair of socks because it was on your right. So to summarize, the benefits of confabulation that we saw play a more important role, of course, when we explain choices that have a more central role in determining our self-image, because the reasons that we offer for our self-defining choices can be a starting point for reflection and for a constructive dialogue with other agents. And by contributing to our sense of ourselves as competent and coherent agents, self-financing and coherent, agents that are embedded in a social context, the benefits of confabulation, I think, are not just psychological. It's not just that they make us feel better about ourselves. I'm a competent decision maker. But may also have an impact on our actual agency, our capacity to achieve the goals that we set for ourselves. Let me go through the other case, the case of optimism. So positive illusions are systematic tendencies that we all have, so non-clinical population, to form beliefs and make predictions that are overly optimistic. And I'm sure you will recognize many of those. The illusion of control is a key one. We believe that we control events that are very often both external and independent of us. A superiority illusion, we believe that we are better than average at most things. And an optimism bias, so we expect our future to be rosier than warranted by the evidence or rosier than the future of other people. And here are some examples. In a betting situation, we tend to bet more money when we are actually rolling the dice, as if the fact that we are rolling the dice could give us a sense that we are in control of what the outcome will be. The better than average effect, and I always choose the case of academics because that's an interesting one. So when college professors are asked whether they do above average work, 94% of them says that they do. Optimism bias is again extremely generalized. We underestimate the likelihood that our marriage will end in divorce, so that we will develop a serious health conditions during our lives. And that happens again in an absolute way, in a comparative way. We think it won't happen to us, but we also think that if it happens to us, it's less likely than if it happens to other people. Unrealistically optimistic beliefs and predictions, just like confabulations, are neither well supported by the evidence nor are responsive to counter-evidence, and so are another case of epistemic irrationality. And indeed, the kind of mechanisms that have been studied and are thought to cause this kind of optimism include incompetence. Sometimes we don't know the subject we are asked about when we are asked to evaluate our own skills in a certain context. Neglect of relevant information. We tend not to think about our failure, just focus on our success. Failure to learn from feedback. People tell us that we are a bit rubbish at something, but we kind of not think of it in that way. We tend to be quite inventive and creative with negative feedback when we get it. Selective updating. Again, we saw an example of this before. If something is evidence against what we believe, we think it's bad evidence. If it's something that is evidence in favor of what we believe, we think it's excellent evidence. And also motivational factors, such as defensiveness. We tend to be defensive when we get negative feedback. And I just want to look at optimism in two interesting cases. These are much more core than consumer choice. How does optimism affect romantic relationships? You've got almost all the types of positive illusions as applied to close relationships. Optimism bias, even those who are very well informed about divorce rates in society, tend to underestimate their own likelihood to get separated or divorced and overestimate the longevity of their relationships. My favorite is the love is blind illusion. We tend to be blind to our partner's faults and perceive our romantic partner as better than average in a number of domains, including intelligence and attractiveness. And the superiority illusion, which is just like the superiority illusion that you apply to yourself, you can apply to your relationship. So we tend to perceive our relationship as better than most relationships, more caring, more lasting, and so on. Now, it won't be a surprise by now, but these kind of irrational beliefs and predictions have a positive effect on our relationships themselves. So, unrealistically optimistic couples have more constructive responses to stressful situations, and these lead them to coping more effectively with a crisis. Their attitude is correlated with greater and more stable relationship satisfaction over time. And this is a very robust result across a number of different types of studies. Moreover, and this is a beautiful quote from Murray and colleagues, so I'll just read it. Intimates who idealize one another appear more prescient than blind, actually creating the relationships they wish for as romance progresses. So this is the case where you think your partner is actually better than he is, but you act in such a way that you make your partner better than he was. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Why is optimism so beneficial to relationships? These are three hypotheses. Optimism protects us from the potentially disruptive effect of conflict and doubt. Positive illusions make it more likely that we deal with problems in an effective way and see the bright side of our partner's faults. So this is called transformation, which is interesting. It's like someone maybe is, I don't know, very lazy, and you think, oh no, actually they have a relaxed attitude towards things. So you kind of rewrite the story. We are more likely to live up to the high standard of our idealizing partners ourselves, increasing our sense of our own self-worth, and coming to perceive ourselves as positively as our partners see us. So being considered better than we are make us want to be better than we are. This is actually, I'm not sure whether this works, but this is a reflective appraisal, and it's really the core of the self-fulfilling hypothesis. What about health? Just the same happens to health. So optimism can apply to physical health, and there are two cases that are quite striking, both classics now, both studied by Shelley Taylor. So the first one is a case of optimism bias, positive prediction. Seropositive men were found to be significantly more optimistic about not getting AIDS than seronegative men, which is clearly an unrealistic prediction. An illusion of control and superiority. So women diagnosed with breast cancer adopt self-enhancing beliefs, such as, I'm stronger as a result of the illness, I can cope better than other cancer patients, again the superiority thing, I can control my health conditions from now on, illusion of control. And interestingly, both groups of people get benefits from that kind of belief. So the study on optimistic seropositive men showed that even when their optimistic predictions were unrealistic, they brought about positive attitudes as coping techniques and greater practice of health-promoting behavior. And similarly, in the case of women diagnosed with breast cancer, they showed that they coped better with their situation when they had self-enhancing beliefs and behaved more responsibly because they believed that they had the power to avoid or delay the illness. So the illusion of control made them take certain precautions and change their lifestyle more, to a greater extent, than women who did not have those self-enhancing beliefs and those illusions. So in these cases, optimism led people to making lifestyle changes in order to restore or maintain their health, and it helped them manage stress, was conducive to them facing rather than avoiding problems. Okay, so where have we got so far? In philosophy, rationality is often considered a precondition for agency or for goal satisfaction. But evidence on systematic tendencies in human behavior suggests that standards of rationality can be and often are violated without compromising agency or successful agency. Moreover, and this is the kind of novel suggestion that needs to be explored in much more depth, some forms of irrationality, such as maybe confabulation and unrealistic optimism, seem to support successful agency, seems to improve our performance. In what way? What is the mechanism? I think the key word here is motivation. So when our choices are integrated in a coherent pattern of behavior that makes sense to us and can be shared with others, we see ourselves as competent and coherent agents. Thanks to overly optimistic beliefs and predictions, we are more productive, more resilient, better at planning, and more effective at problem solving. We are more likely to persist in pursuing our goals in the face of adversities and obstacles. For instance, changing our lifestyle after a diagnosis of a very serious illness. And at least in some domains, we are also more likely to perform satisfactorily and fulfill our goals, leading to success, such as in the relationship case, where we overcome conflict in a positive way. And motivation really seems to be the link between these forms of confabulation and self-enhancement, and successful performance. And this link between self-enhancement and motivation in particular has psychological backing from different research programs. So psychologists who like to use different constructs, sense of coherence, self-efficacy, self-determination, hardiness, optimism, they all seem to agree that confabulation and self-enhancing strategies are beneficial by sustaining motivation. Thinking of myself as a more coherent and competent agent makes me more likely to overcome obstacles and persevere in pursuing my goals, even if the sense of competence and coherence is illusory to start with. It's an illusion. There is also some interesting studies in neuroscience, but this is extremely speculative. I just find it quite interesting that there are other ways, other angles that we can get to the same relationship between self-enhancement and motivation. They suggest that one of our self-enhancing strategies, maybe one of the most common, the self-serving bias, interests the same evolutionarily old regions of the brain that are responsible for controlling goal-directed behavior. So there is a suggestion that self-enhancement is automatically linked, because of our evolutionary past, to an increase in motivation. And I am not sure whether that's true or even how to evaluate that idea. But it seems interesting because one implication of that would be that certain forms of self-enhancement are almost automatic, and they need quite a lot of deliberation to be counteracted. So our default position is to self-enhance, and it's something that we do without realizing that we do it. And when we don't want to do it, then we have to spend a lot of computational effort and conscious attention in trying not to do it. So rationality is hard work. So implications. I think this kind of literature has a lot of implications. Some are purely theoretical about the relationship between rationality and agency. Some are much more practical. But one thing that interests me is how we can revisit the perceived gap between normal and abnormal cognition in the light of this new take on the relationship between rationality and agency. So the presence of irrationality alone does not determine whether some agents are psychologically unwell or they are unsuccessful in achieving their goals, as all agents are irrational and only some are successful. So it's not legitimate to explain certain forms of mental pathology, for instance, with irrationality. Irrationality doesn't explain psychological distress in any way, because it's something much more widespread than something that we find just in the clinical population. Rather, the form of irrationality that we are vulnerable to and the extent of our vulnerability may be important factors to consider in establishing how psychologically healthy and agentially successful we are. Meaning that certain forms of irrationality may be leading to psychological distress, but there are other forms of irrationality that, as I suggested, may actually be good for us and contribute to our mental health. Thank you very much.